You'll notice I didn't mark the carving border on the holster either. Using the compass, the carving border will end up perfect. Then I use a stitching groover to mark the stitching an 1/8 inch in from the edge. Then I mark the stitching spacing in the damp leather. With that done, I start the decorative phase with the swivel knife. Then I move on to the flowers and fill in the pattern from there. With the lines cut, the pattern will look similar to this. On this specific tooling pattern, the next tool I use is the camouflage stamp. Then I use the beveler, starting with the border lines. The pattern will look similar to this when the beveler is done. Next, I use a large 1/2 inch matte beveler to accent the petals of the flowers. These are just tool suggestions. Using your favorite tools will lend your carving your own unique look. The result of the 1/2 inch matte beveler will look similar to this. Next, I use a smooth pear shader to add depth to the leaves and stems. After the pear shader, I use an 11/16 inch veiner. Primarily, I use it for accents for the petals and leaves. After the veiner, I use a stop, followed by mule's foot on a stem. Then I use a 3/8 sunburst stamp to add accent to the stems and leaves. Next, I use a 3/16 and a 1/8 inch cedars, followed by limited decorative cuts. To prepare the background for the bar grounder, I level the background with a small pear shader. This makes it easier to get a good line out of the 1/8 inch 3-hole bar grounder. I like to make running lines with the bar grounder that follow the contours of the carving. It's tedious and it's time consuming, but I like the way it looks. When the tooling is done and the leather still damp, fold the skirt over and align the end of it with the toe tab of the holster. Tap the fold into place to set it. Then I like to shape the holster body in preparation for the weapon. Set it all aside and let it dry. When the holster body is completely dry, the weapon can be fitted to make sure the welt is going to fit. A quick check with the welt gauge will give you the width the welt will have to be for a tight fit, or in this case, a loose fit. To get an accurate length for the safety strap, insert the safety strap gauge into the slot and check the measurements. In this case, the safety strap gauge is close enough to the pattern, I just go with the pattern rather than making any adjustments. After cutting the safety strap to the pattern length, I skive down the end of the thumb break to reduce unnecessary thickness once it's sewn in place. Then I split the end of the safety strap so the base of the snap can be enclosed in the leather. This keeps the snap base from rubbing against the weapon and causing damage to the weapon or its finish. I wear a fillet glove to make sure I don't cut myself. Then, folding back the flesh side of the flap, I punch a snap hole in the hide side only. Then I insert the base of the snap between the flaps with the post exiting the hide side and cement it in place. After the cement has cured, I press the halves together, securing the base of the snap between them. Since this safety strap is going to be tooled, I then wet it front and back. With the compass, I mark the stitching line as well as the lines for the small basket weave stamp I will be using. With the compass lines drawn, I mark the stitching holes around the snap base. Then I cut the border line with a swivel knife and bevel the border. With the border beveled, I start at the tip of the safety strap and stamp my way towards the snap base. The small basket stamp design makes a fine-looking safety strap. Since this holster is on an existing vintage belt, I'm going to age it to match in my rust tank. To stop the iron oxide in the rusty water from turning the leather universally black, I rub organic beeswax onto the surface of the leather I want to look aged. The wax only contacts the raised areas of the leather, leaving the recesses to darken faster. I burnish the wax with soft leather. I do this to all the surfaces I want to appear aged. The leather must be suspended in the rusty water without touching anything. Even the natural fiber thread I use to suspend the leather will leave some mark on the leather. For that reason, I camouflage the thread by putting it in stitching holes in the toe of the holster. To this lower string, I add a bulldog clip as a weight to keep the holster body from floating to the surface of the water. With another length of string, I ensure the holster body will be submerged when hung from the suspension framework. Each item of leather that will be colored or aged in rusty water must be suspended so it won't touch anything else. It takes some experience to know what works best. When all the parts are suspended from the framework, they are lowered into the rust tank. I keep my tank covered to keep out debris. Every rust tank is different, and the leather has to be checked frequently to see how dark it's getting. This is a good batch of rust, and the leather turned in about 35 minutes. When wet, it will appear darker than it will be when it dries. Experience is the best teacher when it comes to running a rust tank. Set the leather aside to dry someplace where the dripping rusty water won't ruin the floor. After the leather is dried, I coat it liberally with extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil is naturally pH balanced and has a natural preservative. It darkens the leather and gives it a rich, mellow finish. The extra virgin olive oil does make it difficult to use cement, however. So anything that will be cemented permanently must be cemented before oiling. I'm going to ignore the fact I added a thin pigskin lining to this leather. This wasn't originally the plan. It was a poor cut of leather just intended to show how the holster was made. But after I spent the time carving and aging it, I didn't want the effort to be wasted because the quality of the leather was poor. So I slapped in a lining. I suspect poor quality leather in the Old West was the primary reason holsters were lined in the old days. Next, I'm going to sew up the tip of the safety strap to secure the base of the snap. At this point, I use gum tragacanth to finish the flesh side and the edges of the leather before assembly. I apply the gum tragacanth with a closed-cell foam brush. The flesh side is burnished down with a glass, and the edges burnished with a wheel. I use this same process on all of the components. With all the leather parts ready for assembly, I set the stiffening rivet in the thumb brake first. Then I set the female half of a line 20 snap. Next, I set the male half of a line 20 snap in the end of the safety strap. After that, the female half of a line 20 snap goes into the loop. Before I sew the thumb brake into the holster, I double check to make sure it will ride well and not interfere with the weapon. I mark the thumb brake with a pencil to make sure it doesn't get displaced before sewing. Sewn into the holster, this is what the thumb brake looks like.